Hello everyone and welcome to your Library at Home. I'm Jade, I'm part of the library's public programming team. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging that we meet today on country. I live and work on Gadigal land and take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who are joining us today. Welcome to our latest Curator's Choice, where we will be hearing from Margot Riley via video recording from yesterday. Margot is a curator in the Research and Discovery branch of the State Library of New South Wales, a cultural historian with special interests in art, popular culture, photography and dress. Margot contributes expertise across a variety of collection functions, including research, acquisition and interpretation. If you have any questions for Margot, you can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and they will be forwarded on to her. Thank you for tuning in today and I will see you all at the end of the talk.
And to revisit a project that I worked on last year. And it was one of those, a very small exhibition, but it was a great opportunity to showcase an extraordinary aspect of the library's collection, which is our posters collection. And the library has a huge array of posters in its collection, over 100,000, and they stretch from the earliest of handbills that were prepared for, first fleet performances, right through to this incredible reward notice for a murder, which is associated with Ned Kelly, and then right up to contemporary poster collecting, because it's a very important aspect of keeping a contemporary feel for the library's collections. To every day we're surrounded by posters on our streets, and some of the most powerful movements in society are actually reflected through poster art, which is reflected in this wonderful series of Real Australians Say Welcome, which we wanted to showcase. So the story behind this talk today is that the library was approached to be part of a festival last year, which was to celebrate protest art from the 1970s. And so I had, in a very short time frame, to whip through the library's collection of, as I say, 100,000 posters and select just 35 to put into an exhibition. So this was a challenge in itself, but it happened at a really great time because we were in the process of reorganising our collections. So now I'm really pleased to say they are so much more accessible. So when people come into the library, it's a really fantastic resource for you to call on our poster collections. So having trawled through this vast array of posters, I came up with the selection that you're going to see now. So the starting point that I had for this was that, in this period, in the late 1960s, we really start to see a shift in the use of posters. Previous to this, they'd really been more about advertising. So beautiful images coming out of the 19th century and into the 20th century, promoting things like travel or, luxury goods, things like that. But with the 1960s, the late 1960s, you start to get the bubbling up of underground use of posters. And the sort of landmark event for this poster production is the student protests in Paris and the setting up of the Atelier Populaire in the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. So that there was this huge social unrest in France, and it went on strike. The whole country went on strike. And the students took over the print studios in Paris, and one of the people that they were working with knew how to do screen printing. Now, this was really a shift, because up until this time, screen printing really wasn't used by anybody except those in the arts world. The newspapers were also on strike, so the students actually had access to a lot of paper, and the newspapers weren't running. There was no television and there was no radio. So the only way that the people of Paris could actually have information was through the posters, and they actually created wall newspapers. So it really enabled them to become highly skilled, but also because they were students in an art situation, they created extraordinary images, extraordinary graphics. And these really impacted poster production around the world. And it's hard to imagine that, people in Australia and students in particular would actually, because pre-internet, how did this information get out? Well, it was through the book. So this book that you can see on the screen here, which the library has a copy of. And that was a real start point for me for the exhibition when I realised that we had a copy of this book, because it really did showcase the style of art that, and it had been acquired around about this time, like just after it was published. So that meant that people in Sydney and Australia would have known how to do this art. They could have actually consulted this. And of course, it's in colour. So you can see from these images, this is the kind of information that's inside the book, and it actually tells you how to do screen printing. So if people didn't know how, they had an instruction book right here. And that was the intent, to sort of send around the world this instruction book on how to do protest art. And certainly it found it of the right home in the State Library's collections. So back in Sydney, probably one of the biggest sort of cause célèbres of this era was the issue around the departure of Jorn Utzon from his Opera House project. Anybody who lives in Sydney very familiar with the story of the fact that Utzon won the prize to design the Opera House, came to Australia, and of course it was a difficult time. He began his work under one political administration, but the political administration changed, and so there wasn't the same level of support for Utzon over time. Also, there was huge issues with budget, and so eventually, because of the difficulties in his working situation, he was forced to offer his resignation, and it was accepted. This caused an absolute outcry amongst people in Sydney. They were almost embarrassed that an internationally regarded architect had been treated this way, and many of the younger, so it sort of indicated a generational split, and young architects and people who were concerned about culture in Australia took to the streets. So rather than perhaps a political demonstration, this was a real social and cultural protest that emerged. And the library, again, is really fortunate to have these fantastic little posters which were produced in support of the Bring Back Utzon campaign, which was, ran for some years, but of course was ultimately unsuccessful. But the posters that you see here were produced by young architects and designers working for the Government Architects Department, and they used in the top image with the red lettering, that's actually using the old type that was from the Government Printing Office. The old type blocks had been discarded, and the students, the public servants had access to these, and so they put together these posters. And they're quite small and different colourways, as you can see, and as time went by, the last one in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the level of sophistication that came to the design of the posters, and these just ended up being peppered around Sydney. So we're really fortunate to have this set of posters. Unfortunately, as I say, the campaign was unsuccessful, and Utzon did leave and had never returned. But we know now that they're working hard to actually bring a lot of his design ideas back to the Opera House that we know today. Of course, the next major social and political issue for Australians was the Vietnam War. And this was a hugely important issue for not just students, people who were perhaps heading for the draft, but family members, women, Save Our Sons campaign, many people who'd been involved in previous wars. And a really fertile time for the design of posters. And this one really struck me, this image of the Vietnamese woman and child. And also then in our Tribune collection, we had this image of the protest coming up William Street to King's Cross, which shows that same graphic. So wonderful to be able to cross-pollinate from a poster into another aspect of the library's collections. And this was one of the biggest protests that took place. Thousands of people took to the streets. And I think it's a great way to see a variety of signs, placards that have been handwritten as well as banners. And you really get that sense of the development of protests, people becoming very much attuned to taking their issues with their feet to the streets. This poster, I'm very fond of the one on the left, done by Martin Sharp, and it was actually as a fundraiser. He designed this beautiful image. Again, it's quite stark, taking the imagery of the Little Prince, which was one of his leitmotifs, and really the doom and gloom of war. It's just the most stunning thing, and again, wonderful for us to have this in the library's collection, and it came to us from Martin Sharp's personal collection. And then you contrast that with the government issue, or not government, sorry, the Vietnam moratorium, so the official kind of poster, which is on the right. And this one I love too, because the way it documents all those sort of protected professions, so it's a really great document. And again, it has the graphic, the logo that many people will recognise as being the Vietnam moratorium logo. One of the next, again, coming out of that student political kind of idea is the activities of Bugger Up. So these began out from Sydney, and it was really more of a guerrilla campaign, taking and using the spray cans. So spray paint had sort of really come to its fore in the late 60s, coming into the 70s, and it's really the beginning of graffiti as we know today. But rather than just that sort of inane tagging that we see, this was graffiti with a political purpose, and it was about defacing advertising on billboards. So this group, and it was men, women in all, I think mostly Melbourne and Sydney, who really objected to a lot of advertising. So mostly cigarette advertising, but anything to do with health issues, objectifying of women, just many different social issues that they felt were inappropriate. Of course, some of the spray painters were arrested, and this poster in the middle is fabulous. It's again, it's a Tin Sheds poster, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Tin Sheds. And some of the spray painters were actually arrested and put on trial because, of course, spray painting was and defacing of the billboards was illegal. But the best outcome of all was that they actually achieved their purpose, the bans on cigarette advertising. And this is a great tribute mural that is actually down in Melbourne, which I just thought was a nice way to see how the issues and don't go away necessarily, and also how they're being honoured today by street artists still. Sorry, that isn't, it's Sydney. There's the good old Centre Point Tower there. So talking about student activity, as I say, Sydney's universities themselves were really important sites for activism in this period. Obviously, students they weren't working, they didn't have to risk a job per se, and they had the opportunity to organise and to sort of experiment perhaps with politics that they may not have had before. Sydney University had the Tin Sheds, which were on City Road, and this wonderful poster here actually shows you the collection of corrugated iron sheds that were on City Road, which was where the art workshops were. And there was a lot of political activity. One of the posters, this is one of the earliest, Support the Strike, was actually because the philosophy department refused to run a course on feminist studies. So there was a strike, a student strike, which was very successful, and they actually overturned the council's decision, and they did set up a feminist studies, women's studies. And I love this poster because it just is, what a knockout. And the artist, Frank Littler, it was just such a joy to find this in the collection. So there's such treasures. It's just a matter of digging away. And again, I didn't know what it was about, but by going to Trove, you can search through the online newsletters, and you can get the backstory to these objects and really set them into their context, which really makes them even more valuable. The other thing that was really key around this time was the environmental concerns of developing. And this sort of citizen action against the gentrification of certain parts of Sydney gave people the tools. It taught them how to be activists. And one of the posters that I really loved is this community propaganda poster project, which was produced again very early in the time of the Tin Sheds workshops. And it actually was about calling people in on its day to the workshops to have a chat, to explain what community propaganda was about and how posters could be used. And that's all this information that is on this poster. And it's a bit crazy, like really you wouldn't make a poster like that today. It's really quite odd. But I do love that it references this stunning poster here on the right by Jan Mckay, which is about the King's Cross development project, trying to stop development in King's Cross. As I say, so the Tin Sheds was a place where many young artists either learned these skills of poster making or brought their own artistic training with them when they had the opportunity to work within the Tin Sheds. It ran from the late 60s through to the 90s, through different phases of production. There was the Earthworks Posters Collective and Lucifoil, and then the Tin Sheds Posters Collective itself. And they focused their work, and as time went by, you know, as you can see from these previous slides, they're really quite simple, quite crude, you know, one colour, hand-cut stencils, things like that. But as time went by, they got much better, much more sophisticated, really stunning and really beautiful big posters and really important landmark designs that are still relevant today. Then around about this time too, some people became aware that these were collectible, that they were artworks. They weren't just throwaway art that was plastered up on a wall. And the first exhibition of posters happened at the Waters Gallery in East Sydney. This is the poster for that exhibition by Tony Robertson and Chips McNulty. And the two figures, I love how it sort of keeps going into infinity, because the poster has the two poster artists actually bill posting a poster that's on the wall. So it just keeps going. And this is Geoffrey Legg outside the Waters Gallery. And the famous tagline that appeared on the wall of the gallery: posters for factory walls, not gallery walls. But it did end up commodifying these posters and made people realise they had a value, an artistic value. One of the things I was able to collect was I was able to add to the collection last year with this fantastic set of band posters for the electric fans. So they are by the poster artist, Sheila, who's, oh dear, it's going to, Shona White, sorry, skipped my mind. But again, we were able to marry photographs that we had of the electric fans in performance with this stunning band poster. And they were one of the early feminist bands in Sydney, and they played at the International Women's Day march in Hyde Park. So just to be able to bring all those little bits together and tell a story through a number of different collection areas was great. Bill posting was an incredibly important part of the work that was done. It was, I think, you know, it built teams. So people would be working on it. They would have, a cause would come up, they would go, they would respond very quickly, they'd design a poster, they'd get them out, they'd run around the streets of Sydney, they'd make the glue and slap them up at night. And that was all part of the excitement of being a political activist at the time. So the streets of Sydney were papered with these incredible posters. And of course, they didn't last very long because there was always another cause and another poster coming over top. And of course, eventually bill posting became illegal. So people were arrested for doing this work. So it did become a very furtive act, under the cover of darkness. But I do think it added, an element of excitement to what was going on. But even more reason for us to be really mindful of collecting, because these things can disappear quite quickly. And I love this selection of posters here. This one in particular by Toby Zoats, it was actually a fundraising dance to raise money for people who've been arrested for, a protest. And he actually uses, these are photographs from a newspaper that are, so it's collaged onto the surface. So this is actually, it must be unique, I would imagine, and just stunning the way the blood is sort of dripping down through the poster, and on really funny kind of thin, kind of shiny butcher's paper. It's the most extraordinary object. So sometimes there's that three-dimensionality and the tactile nature of the posters as well that you get at this period because they are so simple. These here, some of these are on computer printout paper and it's recycled. You know, the old computer printout paper had the dots down the side, and often they've got printed text on the back. So they've reams and reams that must have come from the accounting departments or somewhere at Sydney Uni that were then recycled to actually make these posters, which again, I love them. They're some of my favourites. And this one was another, which I thought was so quirky, you know, We're With You, Ray. So this was a very small print run put together by John Tranter in Glebe. And it was about Ray Denning, who was a career criminal, who was actually also a serial escapologist. He had managed to escape, he was the first person to manage to escape from Parramatta Prison, and he sort of was on the run for some months, and he became a bit of a pin-up boy for prisoners' rights in Sydney at the time. He wrote a diary, and parts of it were published in the student magazine, Thurunka. So, you know, I think anyone who is interested in those kinds of issues was, you know, behind Ray. Unfortunately, he did end up being recaptured and returned to prison. Yes, so poor old Ray, we didn't get away with it. So cultural activism, again, was this sort of explosion of concerns around many, many issues that happened following the fall of the Whitlam government, where a lot of student areas had received funding for the first time, and then Fraser came in, and there were huge cuts to a lot of these services, and people reacted through poster art, of course. So I love the one of Keep Warm This Winter. The graphic is borrowed from punk graphic in England. So again, really quick. I think it's like even 12 months through magazines like The Face and ID, things like that. All of the styles of graphic design that were happening overseas were informing the design that we see here. And same with the poster on the right. This is very much based on American style of cartoon graphic. So really interesting to see how in step with global practices Australian poster makers were, again, without the internet. So, and culture, the arts. So this was an area where, you know, there had been real opportunities for, you know, new innovative styles of art during the Whitlam era. And this poster speaks to the work of Michael Matu, who was a really important and very little known these days figure in that sort of Australian style of crazy and radical cabaret. He was actually, there was I'm going to get caught up with my words here. Lindsay Kemp, who was an artistic director from England, was visiting Australia, and he actually encountered Michael Matu, and he took him back to England, or they went, eventually they worked together in England. And so this poster that we see here, when I first saw it, I thought, oh my gosh, that's David Bowie. It's not David Bowie, it's Michael Matu, because that style actually influenced David Bowie. So Ziggy Stardust and the look of Ziggy Stardust is taken from Michael Matu, which very few people are aware of. So to think of an Australian performer having that kind of an impact on what we think of as 20th century, you know, culture, an iconic person like Bowie is quite extraordinary. And the images on the other side are some of the other activities of Matu. So you see Matu in some of his disguises or looks. And the poster is by Martin Sharp, and it was produced for a show, the sideshow Burlesco, that Matu did in the downstairs Nimrod Theatre. Nimrod Theatre had opened at this time as well, and this is 1979 that the poster was created. Mural art was incredibly important at the time, about community, really reflecting the stories of the people in which the mural appeared. And the one on the lower right is the Woolloomooloo, one in the Domain car park, which unfortunately is gone, and the top is the Redfern mural. And there was a fantastic, well, it sounds fantastic, I wasn't there, seminar at Sydney University about mural making, and an incredible book produced at the time again about how to encourage this community activity around Australia. It's not something that we really see anymore. I suppose some of the street and graffiti art that's being sponsored by councils has somehow taken the place of this, this style of art. Another area of got government support, early government support, really changed the landscape for the industry was filmmaking. And so the Filmmakers Cinema was set up in Darlinghurst, and there was a launch pad for many of our internationally famous directors now. But I did love the idea of the Super 8 Film Festival. So this was like the poor cousin to the much larger feature film type footage. And it really, they used to have open mic nights, and you could just bring along your own little bit of Super 8. And apparently, like all the sort of bohemians and people from squats and crazy footage from wherever got to have its moment in the sun at these Super 8 film festivals at the Filmmakers Cinema. Unfortunately, again, with funding cuts, it was shut down, but it really was a launch pad for so many really important, people like Gillian Anderson and Philip Noyce and Albie Toms, all were key to the Filmmakers Cinema. And of course, issues of the day focusing on anti-uranium and anti-nuclear, stunning posters that and fundraisers. You can see it's a fundraising dance, like a snakes and ladders game, but with a dollar sign. They're just really clever. Beautiful, beautiful things. I'm conscious that I need to keep scrolling through this very powerful image by Pam Debenham, which is incredibly iconic. And I contrasted that with this other anonymous poster, which I still think is incredibly powerful. The graphic of the map of Australia with the name of all the different of the places where the mining was going on, and the US bases. US bases. We don't know who made this poster, so it's unique, a one-off, and again, very, very homemade, very simple. Community activism was sort of the next area that I focused on. And again, this was where arts initiatives, so from the tin sheds, a lot of the artists who'd worked there left and moved out to other collectives. And there was the Matilda Graphics group, there was others. And this one is the work from the Garage Graphics, which was set up in Blacktown out in Western Sydney. And they were really focused on creating posters that reflected the interest and the issues of the community. So this series looking at the beginnings of NAIDOC Week, which of course we're celebrating next week. At the time, the people of the community, the government was saying that it should be in September, but the people wanted July. So it's great that sorry, NAIDOC Week is not next week. I'm sorry. It is next week? Sorry. I have COVID brain, sorry. Anyway, yes, so it was in July, but now it's next week. Anyway, what is interesting about this poster is it was done in collaboration with students from the high school, and the text that you see, you have the photograph of the students in the middle, and then their own little statements about the importance of having an Aboriginal week, which, great to have that documentation. When you go to the poster, you're actually reading their words. So it's an extraordinary document and survivor. And this one in particular really resonated with me because at the time I was doing the work, it was the time of the trials that we were having about child sexual abuse. And this really quite prescient poster produced in 1986, where you have this extraordinary graphic where, the voice, the message is, how could such a thing happen? And these children, sort of images of young people from their future going, how could, what is this about? I just thought that really communicated in a very non-threatening way just how unacceptable that practice is. So again, I was really keen to include that in the exhibition. And I like this one too, because there was very much at this time an awareness that there wasn't a place for young women to be expressing themselves through artwork. So this was an initiative of the Department of Education. Two young activists, Amanda Holt and Liz Newell, went out to different groups, not only schools, but also to hostels, to talk with women, young girls who were perhaps marginalised and not being met, their needs not being met through other arts, perhaps arts initiatives, and they developed a series of posters. The girls themselves decided what the subjects would be. They took all the photographs, they learned how to make the posters. And this was like the banner poster for the series. So we have Amanda on the left and Liz on the right. I hope that's right. Okay, so that's bringing us to the end of our whistle-stop tour of posters from the library's collection. As I say, we continue to collect posters to this day, certainly through the activism that we're seeing around us all the time. We currently have collecting projects for Black Lives Matter and for any of the environmental issues that are around. So if anybody has that kind of material, please don't hesitate to let the library know. And maybe you can add something to the library's collections, or you may have been an activist in the 60s, 70s and 80s and have a fabulous stash under your bed, in which case we'd still like to see them. Thank you for joining me. Bye.
Thank you to everyone for joining us. I encourage you, if you think of any questions for Margot, please send them through to bookings@sl.nsw.gov.au. Thanks so much to Margot from Thursday's recording. It was such a wonderful talk and we look forward to more upcoming Curator's Choice. For all our other events and to access some of our previous online events, please check the library website and visit our What's On page. Hope you all have a lovely weekend. Until next time.